It's an Archaeodeath interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest. Welcome, Archaeodeathlings, to another Archaeodeath interview with me, Professor Howard Williams, and my special guest today, Dr Penny Bickle of the University of York. I should say the Department of Archaeology at the University of York. And Penny is an expert in all things Neolithic and all things archaeological in the Neolithic across Europe. And I'm just really excited to be able to talk with her today, because while we're going to have a deathly discussion, we're going to be looking at life and death in the Neolithic in our conversation. So hello, Penny, how are you?
I'm very well this afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to come and speak to you today, Howard.
Oh, it's really exciting because you generously, we exchanged research seminars for each other. I did one in York and you did one just a few months back, and I thought this would be a really great person to augment this growing sort of number of interviews I've been doing. So we have some sort of personalities in their research on all things mortuary, and I do have conversations with prehistorians, much as I'm goaded to the contrary by some of my colleagues, and you are a prime example. And so thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And I just wanted to sort of kick off by sort of asking you, for viewers' benefit, give us a sort of sense of your background. How did you get into archaeology before we deal with deathly matters?
So I first got into archaeology aged 8 when we did a primary school project on Egyptology. And I found out about archaeology. I found out mainly about the little scarab beetle beads, which I was fascinated by. And we went to a local museum and we saw mummies and in the museum, and we got a talk from an archaeologist at the museum, and I decided aged 8 that was really what I wanted to do with my time. And then when it came to applying for universities, I'd taken A-levels that were English, chemistry and maths, which was quite a broad range of different things. And I spoke to a careers person and she was like, what could I recommend to you? And I said, well, when I was 8, I wanted to be an archaeologist. And she said, great, perfect mix for the sciences and the humanities. So I ended up applying to do archaeology and just really fell in love with it. And by the end of my degree, knew it was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I went and worked in commercial archaeology for a while. And I really enjoyed that. I really learned an awful lot while I was doing that, but I knew the Neolithic was the thing that I wanted to study. I kind of wanted to go back and do more of that. So I pitched up in Cardiff to do the Masters in Neolithic Europe with Alistair Whittle, and ended up staying there for 10 years to do my PhD, and then a couple of postdocs with him as well.
Wow, the eminent Whittle. Yes, fantastic. And I think that's where I first met you, wasn't it? When I was a 1-year lectureship. It was supposed to be 2 years, but I jumped somewhere else, after that first year, because I knew it was temporary. But I was there at Cardiff. Yay!
Yeah.
It's a great department and fantastic people. Although obviously times have moved on and some of them have retired and so on, but it's still a cool place. And I just have to say, as an aside, maths, chemistry, history for me.
Another mix of those two different areas. Yes.
Maths was a bad move though for me. I was too good at it at GCSE level, and I thought I lost interest, and I just flunked it massively. But I managed to creep into university and get beyond that humiliation. But no, I agree. My point is, mixture of science and arts, social sciences is a really good sort of combo for going into archaeology. We take students with all sciences, all non-sciences, but I think that's a good mix, and I think that's a really good sort of takeaway point for people watching this. Yeah. But what about then? So you went through all these postdocs, and obviously following Alistair Whittle, who's sort of a established scholar on the European Neolithic in terms of fieldwork and publication. Sorry. Where did death creep into, the study of, obviously every human period of the human past has to contend with mortuary matters, but you were really looking at daily life. So how did mortuary archaeology begin to creep in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I definitely started off my PhD. I was really interested in the daily life of a period we call the Linearbandkeramik, the LBK for short, which is in Central Europe. It's the first Neolithic period across a vast area, really, from the Ukraine all the way through to the Paris Basin. And they built these huge longhouses, which are massive, great big post-built structures. They were on average 20 meters long, though some have been found up to 65 meters long, which are just huge. And I I was really interested in daily life, and I wanted to know how people lived with these structures. There'd been a little bit of work around the symbolism of the houses. Richard Bradley had written some really interesting things about their orientation, and I just thought there was more to be said and more possibility to be said. And so I knew there were burials on settlements, but I didn't think that they were going to really influence my PhD very much, or influence my work for my PhD very much. And then to do the PhD that I did, I focused on the Paris Basin. I had to go to Oxford to use the library there because the sites that I was working on were already published, and they were published as a journal while they were doing the excavations through the late 70s and into the 80s. And the journal wasn't in Cardiff. It's very analog times. I needed to go and look at the hard copies. They were in the Sackler Library in Oxford. So I used to have to go there, and I read through them, and they're fantastic, brilliant resource. There's loads more still to be said about them. But I was reading through them, and I came across one house that I'd been looking at. And alongside these houses were these loam pits. So these pits where they were digging out the clay to make the wattle and, make the daub alongside the houses. And in one of these pits, a child had been buried. And that was nothing surprising really for the LBK. We knew that. We knew that there were burials on settlements, that they were alongside houses. And the attitude had pretty much been before, well, we know Neolithic people used settlements for burial. That's where they lived. So that's kind of where the burials happened. Or there'd kind of been this sense that this was where the low status burials were, or the not very important burials were. But this particular burial, someone had cleaned out a section of this pit, which had been filling up with household rubbish, and had sprinkled a layer of ochre colouring on the little scoop that they cleaned out. And then they placed the child, they nestled them in this ochre, and then had covered them back in. And it was just really striking to me that, and it became really clear to me that these burials weren't just something that happened around the settlements, that there were actually stories here being told. And I think really particular and intimate moments that people were having around the settlements, and the idea that these were, because they were low status, they were devalued, not just within the population and the people who were living in these settlements, but also for our archaeological narrative, became to sort of frustrate me a little bit. And I started researching and thinking a little bit more about the impact of death in people's daily routines, and how much I think for prehistory, and specifically for the Neolithic as well, death must have been part of that daily round. And so we find disarticulated human remains in these pits as well, and the kind of interpretation had been, well, it's just because when people come across an earlier burial, they don't value it very much, or they don't know what it is, so they just throw people out with the rubbish. But because I was also looking at the animal bone, what was happening to the animal bone, I saw a parallel then, that I'm pretty sure, given how much time people spent butchering animals, people knew about the insides of people's bodies. They knew what they looked like. I'm pretty sure if you're able to identify a cow bone and say, I'm going to make that into this type of tool, and here's a sheep bone, I'm going to make it into that type of tool, you're going to be able to identify a human skeleton when you come across it in the settlement. And so that set me down a whole path of first thinking that for the Neolithic, death was part of daily life, that it was part of people's approaches to settlements and their rounds, but also that actually Neolithic people themselves were probably quite knowledgeable and quite engaged with the processes of death, and with understanding what happened to bodies after death in a way that I think we today might be quite isolated from.
That's really interesting, isn't it? About the, if you are regularly processing animal bodies of any size and scale, while obviously they're not the same as a human, you will have that engagement with the smells, the textures, again contrasting, but also the similarities and the anatomical elements. And that's a fascinating area of discussion, because how it bleeds into mortuary practice, what you do with other kinds of materials, animal bodies, pottery, and so on. That's fascinating. So and can I just also flag up for viewers, because I think it's really often we gain a sense, well, I think the external world gains a sense that it's through primarily field work that one as an archaeologist first encounters mortuary questions. And while I must say, I confess, I did get excavate on sites with a few skeletons. My interest in mortuary archaeology came through the literature, like you. That it wasn't. While I saw a few infant burials and other burials on sites I was involved in. It wasn't like, something I'd spent a lot of time excavating myself or working in a lab on, although I did some undergraduate sort of lab-based stuff. And so I think that's really interesting as a parallel, that you came at this as it's a problem, it's a question, it's a research question, that you're looking into the funerary domain because it bleeds into, it interacts so closely with domestic context. So thank you for that. And I did want to ask about that because, I mean, is there a single stereotype that, popular misunderstanding or at least generalization about the Neolithic and death rituals and attitudes to the dead, or is there do you think ever, the broader academic communities and beyond do get that there's incredible variety? I don't know.
I think there's sort of two answers to this question. I think the Neolithic suffers a little bit for being the period that the grand synthesizers worked on. So the Gordon Childs, also to a certain extent, Alistair Whittle, Andrew Sherratt, Mike Parker Pearson, Julian Thomas, they've written these big grand synthesis of the Neolithic, which can give the impression sometimes that we figured it out.
Yeah.
And that we know all of the patterns, and that they're there. There's also a tendency, I think, within coming to this kind of idea of synthesis, that we do tend to iron out some of the wriggles a little bit when you do write it. Whereas I think when people are working at the coalface a little bit more, they begin to see that kind of variability in a little bit more detail. In the specific context that I work in the LBK, it's that debate between uniformity of practices and diversity has really shaped how people approach the LBK, because it's considered almost to be the most uniform archaeological culture. The pottery is incredibly similar. They lived in incredibly similar houses, and their burial practices seem to sit within a particular lexicon, if you like, of ranges of doing things, which have perhaps meant that we've overlooked those moments of variation and their significance in quite some detail. Particularly, I think, because we've had this hierarchy of thinking about what's normal and what's different in terms of burials. So cemetery burials are very familiar. They were kind of considered to be the normal high status or normal status burials. And then when you started looking at settlements, well, they were a bit lower down. And then you had some disarticulated human remains, and they were, lower down on the rung still. And then you had all sorts of other contexts where we found burials such as caves. There's also been some really sort of detailed and debated work at some causewayed enclosures where we might have massacre sites, such as Aspern Schletz, and then also Herxheim, which people may have heard of, which has been suggested to actually be evidence for cannibalism at the end of the Neolithic. And then we have some evidence for mass graves as well, after incidences of what seemed to be mass violence. So sites like Talheim, that was excavated and published in the 1980s, which people are often very aware of, where people seem to have been to have received violent acts, particularly on their skulls with particular stone tools, and then buried in a big pit. And then we have one more recently excavated and published called Killian Staten, where there's an awful lot of violence and paleopathology, particularly trauma after death, evidenced on the skeletons, which suggests we've got a whole range of different burial practices going on. And we seem to kind of, and I think very much through our own interpretations, our own understanding of death, go, these are normal deaths, and this is the normal way of doing things. So this tells us about life, and those are the non-normal deaths, and those tell us about other things. So I think this raises a really interesting question, which is about the timings of burials, which is something I've got a recent project on, in which we're thinking about the cemeteries, because we kind of look at the cemeteries as being representative of quite a long period of time, but actually they seem to just date to the end of the LBK. And we're really lucky to have a few projects now. The National Environment Research Council's facility grants have given us now 100 radiocarbon dates. So we are dating some cemeteries to try and get a better handle on whether they are long periods of time or actually something a bit different to how we think about our own cemeteries that are used today.
That's a really fascinating point, because we have these archaeologically created periodizations, and we have a archaeological site from that period, and that becomes a type site or a typical site, or whether it's exceptional or normal, it becomes embodies that for people, doesn't it? And yet you have examples there where, you know, that may only relate to a very small fraction of that entire epoch or period, that you suddenly is either has no funerary remains or very different funerary activities in the record. That's fascinating. That should really yield some interesting results. So am I right in saying, therefore, what you're saying is there's various stereotypes, the stereotypes of uniformity and big synthesis, but there's also a sort of a peaceful, harmonious stereotype, that death was sacred and ceremonial, multi-stage, but there was no violence, there was no abruptness, there was no, I don't know. Is that a fair way of describing it? Or
I think that it was either one or the other. So
okay.
we have peaceful, normal deaths where people were placed with ceremony, with grave goods, which were associated with who they were in their lives, and nice, neat, tidy packages. And then we have violence as something different and out of the ordinary, which sets the people apart, and it's a different story, and it's not going to tell us very much about that kind of daily ritual practice, if you like, that it's odd and weird and different. And I'm not sure those binary definitions are as useful as we perhaps thought they were.
And so how is this working out now in your past? You said many different projects. I mean, how have you been dealing with mortuary data then in your projects? How have you, I mean, you've already really answered this in part, but I'm just interested in, have you got any further case studies for us of how you've been dealing with this life death, you know, relationship?
Yeah, so I came to working more practically with human remains through working with isotopes. So when I finished my PhD in 2008, we were in the midst of a financial crisis, and I thought, oh, I'll go back and do some digging. Maybe I'll apply for a few postdocs, but I'm going to go back and be a field archaeologist, a commercial archaeologist. There weren't any jobs, and in fact, I think I applied to like jobs all over the place, and the projects that were being funded at the time were isotope projects. There were a lot of isotope projects. It was just beginning to kind of be the kind of zenith, if you like, of people doing isotope studies. So that was the postdoc that I got, luckily in Cardiff. I am very lucky to have had that position, and it was the first time that I'd worked with human remains professionally, if you'd like, rather than encountering them on an excavation. I had to be trained to take samples for isotopes, and isotopes tell us about people's lives. So you take a part of the skeleton, whether that's a piece of tooth or a piece of bone, and it tells you about the diet, it tells you about the protein content in the diet, and it tells you, the enamel particularly tells you about where people were living, and perhaps the landscapes that they were sourcing their diets off. And so that tells you all about life. And it was my responsibility in the project to take the samples. So I was very lucky to get to go and travel around the LBK to go and take the samples, and work in various different museums and different places to get to do that. But it was also my job to sort of do the burial interpretation of those isotopes. And this was the first time I met a problem which I think archaeologists have been grappling with for a long time, which is that life doesn't always map onto death in neat and tidy ways. And I think the premise of the project was that we didn't expect that, but we only really found sort of two significant patterns with the isotopes. And the first one was that women seemed to be moving around more than men in the data that we had. That's since changed a bit as we've got some more data and perhaps looked at things a little bit more regionally. That seems to perhaps change a little bit between the East and West, but also that men buried with one particular object, these polished stone tools, seem to have a more limited mobility than other people at the sites, which interested me so much, because encountering this, I thought that how people were being treated in death would not be that much associated with the conditions in which they were living in childhood. So our isotopes, our strontium isotopes from the teeth come from childhood, the teeth grow in childhood. And I think what I was grappling with, and what we were grappling with in that project, is this idea that's quite an old one in sort of mortuary archaeology that comes down to us from processionalism, from Sachs and from Binford, about this social persona idea that how someone is in life is represented in death. And I think because I hadn't written the project and I hadn't really thought about it before I started as a job, I'd applied for a job and turned up and I had all of this practical stuff to do. It was only as we were writing it up that I was suddenly like, oh yes, that's why everyone's been criticising this approach, and why it's so important that when you are using bioarchaeological data, when you're thinking through paleopathology, when it's ancient DNA, that you really do think and try and come to an interpretation for what's happening around death practices, that this isn't just one individual with a set of grave goods that they carried around with them during their life that kind of neatly displays who they were in life being buried with them, that actually there's a whole set of practices going on around how people in the Neolithic were negotiating death, how they were thinking about the community, what the person, what happened was going to happen to that person after they've been buried, expressions of the community going on. It's not just a convenient little story for archaeologists to come along and excavate and then compare to the isotopes.
So that's fascinating, and your ability to harness and critically evaluate that material rather than just taking it at face value, I think is one of your skills, but I think it's one of the skills that is an ongoing challenge for the discipline, isn't it? Of being, ADNA and now, as well as stable isotopes. These are the bigger challenges we face in negotiating those different sort of the qualifications with resource material. That's fascinating.
That was one of the reasons behind us setting up the Funerary Archaeology Masters programme at York, was that I'd been grappling with this. I'd been very much a humanities sort of trained archaeologist. I was big into theory. I like my archaeological theory. And then I suddenly encountered all of these isotopes, and I felt like there was a skill set available to me, which I didn't have when I'd encountered them. And so part of the reason for us creating the Funerary Archaeology Masters course here in York, because we have such a strong bioarchaeology section already, we wanted to equip students to be able to be positioned to do that once they graduate, to say, I'm confident with learning perhaps more of the science side around the human body. They can take modules and have lectures on isotopes and ancient DNA, but be able to sort of communicate that through the language of that archaeology uses around death and the critical questions that we ask. I think it's really important, and I think it's also really exciting because we're beginning to break down some of the kind of siloed knowledge that we've had in archaeology in the past.
Fantastic. And so that leads me to sort of really sort of ask about sort of some of the, I don't know, there's so many different ways we could go with this, but I wanted to particularly ask you about the fact you're working so much more geographically broader in your your research across the whole of Europe in parts, but large parts of Europe, not the whole of Europe, the ALBK. And in doing so, of course, you're encountering different field practices, different museum collection practices in a way that I certainly haven't in my career. And I was interested in how that works for burial archaeology or mortuary archaeology more broadly. Have you encountered particular challenges with the quality, character of the field work you're trying to utilize, or the broader intellectual context in which that material has been presented?
Yes, I think is the short answer to that. There's been a lot of challenges and a lot of variety. I've worked a lot with legacy excavations that happened a long time ago, before sort of modern curation practices came into being, which means that people have been very liberal with the glue in terms of preserving human remains, which is, even in one incident, found a mandible glued very firmly to the maxilla along the plate of the teeth, which is not very useful if you're an osteologist wanting to look at this person's dental health, nor if you're an isotope specialist wanting to take a small amount of enamel to analyse the person's isotopes. It also means that collections can be lost, and sometimes unraveling who is in which box can be quite challenging. It's also rather thrilling sometimes to go through some of the older collections. So for a recent project that I was working on, I went out with my postdoc to sample in Strasbourg Museum. We had to sample in the library of the museum because that was the only space that they had for us to go and work on the osteological collections, which is the first time I've done that. But they had the original 1930s, 1940s excavation reports, which were photographs and notes written by hand in big books. So we spent some time looking through them, which was just fantastic to be able to, the clothing that people were wearing in the photographs, the things that people were noticing, the incidences in the diaries around the excavation. Really interesting, really sort of about the history of archaeology itself, not just about the collection that we're studying. Each country has a different set of a way of storing human remains. So in some cases things go to big stores, sometimes things go to big museums, sometimes they're parceled out to recent to local museums. In the countries that I've worked in, the recent politics of the 20th century has had a big impact on that as well. So for example, there are osteological collections held in the Czech Republic that were excavated in Slovakia. And things, of course, have been damaged during times of war, so particularly the Second World War. One of the things that I noticed that is really interesting, it's not to do with mortuary archaeology, but so interesting, I have to tell you, in the library in Strasbourg, that predates the end of the Second World War. So the Nazis obviously occupied those areas during the Second World War, and there are stamps approving the books prior to that in the front of them, and someone has gone through with a pencil and crossed them out. Yet just over the border, just over the Rhine into Germany, it's illegal to display any Nazi symbols. So they would have been removed from the books if they were present there. And I find details like that give you an insight into kind of the 20th century history, let alone into sort of the Neolithic history, quite interesting. Each country also has a different attitude to the ethics of sampling, but I'd say that on the whole, curators are working incredibly hard. They're in a difficult situation at the moment because there's so much destructive sampling going on, and I just have huge respect for those curators and osteologists and museums that I've worked with who have just, they're working really hard. They're not necessarily experts in all the latest techniques, and working hard to set up sampling procedures really to make sure that they're preserving their collections. They have a very tough job.
Well, you sound like you have a very tough job too in terms of negotiating, such far-ranging collections, and it does make me want to ask about how you've navigated those politics, but also any broader pop culture, political relationship of your work, or have you managed to steer clear of the public archaeology of death, not necessarily in terms of controversy yourself, but in terms of the broader sort of issues that we face as archaeologists working with once living humans?
Yeah, there is politics in terms of working across different countries. For the most part, though, people just want to do the best thing by the collections. That means slightly different things in different countries, and I need to be sensitive to that in my work.
Sure.
One of the examples I give is that in France, there's a tendency, because it's a secular society that prides itself on being a secular society, there is a tendency for osteological collections, particularly prehistoric ones, to be viewed less as less within the ethics of human remains and more within the ethics of preservation just generally. And that changes your questions, but it doesn't change the issues around the preservation and asking robust research questions so that you're not damaging collections that are valuable for the future. And making sure, so in France I find that the requirements for collecting information before you do destructive sampling is very rigorous, and that's really important. And they also have quite a set of different procedures to go through as you request sampling, and I think it's really important to follow those. Though on the other side, they then have a very different attitude to human remains than people would have in other parts of the world. I think that's really where I've encountered politics around the sort of the public archaeology of death, really, is that when you do work with different cultures and different approaches, they can butt up against each other in certain ways. So, for example, imagine if you do not think of yourself as being part of a privileged society, such as Eastern European societies have had a real challenge to reassert their independence over the last 50 years. They're really proud of some of their deep histories, and they have every right to be proud of the archaeology that they're doing within them. And part of that for them is displaying their dead and their prehistoric ancestors, I guess, in that respect. And they want to be able to do that and to express this. But on the other hand, there are cultures in other parts of the world where it's not acceptable to display human remains. And then if you're warning people that you're going to be displaying human remains when those people are saying, this is my history and I want you to talk about it, why are you warning people? It's not something to be ashamed of. There's a conflict there, which is hard to navigate. I would always now say to people, there are going to be human remains in this presentation, or I would advise people, if they were in that situation, to say, I'm going to be displaying human remains in this context. But you need to be aware that the politics is not clear cut of us and them, or here and now and then, and there are other nuances within that, and particularly in Europe, around the different histories of different countries.
That's really interesting, because I think certainly a broader, my research on, as an editor, but also as a researcher, has led me to realise how, yes, while there is a broader global discussion, it's a very Anglophone discussion, and it's very driven by post-colonial context, and rightly so. And yet I do wonder how, and certainly in the edited book I did with Mel Giles, Estella Weiss-Cracy's paper from an Austrian perspective, I think was a good counterbalance. But I think there are further stories out there that I really don't think have had the airing, and I think I must very deeply frustrate, as you say, some countries, and that's part of a broader political dynamic, isn't it, of Europe, and Europe as in how, as a monolithic thing, but also as a collection of countries, and how their voices are heard. And I do wonder how there's more to be done there to, I think, have those conversations in a non-patronising or dictatorial way. I think so. There is in at least in Central Europe and perhaps parts of Eastern Europe as well, a contemporary tradition of still displaying the dead. Do you think that means that there's a more openness in religious and cultural and political terms to the investigation of the ancient dead? There's less sort of ethical concerns in that sense of display.
That's a really interesting question. I hadn't connected kind of an openness for the study and display of prehistoric remains with that more recent religious tradition of ossuaries and of displaying human remains, particularly in churches, and constructing really quite wonderful displays of multiple skulls and bones into different patterns. But actually, I think you're probably right. I wonder whether that's a really interesting question. I think I'm going to have to go away and think about it after this interview a bit more. But I think the thing I want to say in response to that is that I think that there's a tendency to see that as dehumanizing. But I actually think what's going on is a consideration of what we mean by human, and that is working towards the ways in which over the last few centuries we've been working towards the situation that we're in now, where people are their bodies and their identity are quite conflated, and sort of death disrupts that in some way. So people need to respond to it in some way. They need to have some kind of reaction to this breaking down of this individual, and sort of figuring it out. And I think maybe we've lost touch with that a bit. and death is very hidden away and put away, whereas these sort of European traditions where actually figuring out and responding to what's happening to the body and to the person that they've lost, and refiguring the community after that person has passed away. It's part of that death work that's going on, and I suspect you're right that there is a relationship there between studying the body in the past, the deep past, such as prehistory, and the more recent traditions around displaying skeletons and viewing the body after death as well.
And that leads me to a point I hadn't thought about before, which is I was having another interview with Dr Kenny Brophy, who, as one of his projects on contemporary archaeology, is investigating these modern megaliths being constructed as columbaria for the cremated dead in the UK, as a new sort of non-religious, well, they are actually, there are spiritual dimensions and pagan elements, but it's not denominational, obviously. New mode of disposing of the dead. It would only be in the UK that we need to do that, in the sense, because many parts, not all parts of Europe, but many parts of Central Eastern Europe still have those connections to bones, and churches, at least partially in some places, fulfill that role. But anyway, that's a really, it's a, I think that we can see not just simply national but regional and local differences there that I think need to be taken into account. And I think so easy, again and again, I see archaeologists trying to write on a global canvas, but then forgetting the nuances, that you can't, what works for Washington State doesn't necessarily work for Florida, doesn't necessarily work for Suriname, certainly doesn't work for Bulgaria. These different, we have to be aware of archaeologists working in very different socio-political, economic contexts, and human remains are part of that enmeshed relationship, aren't they, I guess? Yeah. Sorry, I did want to perhaps wrap up by asking you really a final question about the future of our research in mortuary archaeology, and whether you had any sense of where things are going, whether you want to reflect back on your own recent projects, or you want to, just make some more general comments. I wonder whether you had any sort of takeaway points about the future of, archaeologists dealing with the dead, and whether for the Neolithic or for any period.
I'm super excited about the future, if I'm honest. I think we've just entered a really exciting time for funerary archaeology, where the discussions around DNA and isotopes and some of those frustrations, I think, are actually beginning to break down. A lot of projects that I see are archaeology led or have a very strong archaeology component to them. I'm seeing some really interesting conversations. I know you've spoken to Lindsay Buster around continuing bonds and about rethinking grief and getting into the emotion and accounting for the emotions around death, and actually finding some quite exciting ways of thinking through those with the material remains that we have of the past. I'm really excited about that. We've had some great discussions in class with students about those kinds of ideas, about not just confronting death in the past, but using death in the past to challenge us in the modern world to really engage with issues around dying and mortality, and I think I guess archaeology having a stronger role in some of those conversations than it's had up to date, which I think is really exciting. And I think the third thing that I'm seeing is, I think, a real interest and excitement around the treatment of human remains, not just as, okay, so they were buried, here are the grave goods, that's the end of the story, but that temporal pattern around death as well. So I think we've had very much a kind of, here's the person while they were alive, then they were dead.
Yes.
And I think that, and some of your work has inspired this, like your work on cremation and working through the different types and times of cremation. And I think that's coming back to us again. And sort of, just because someone was buried didn't mean they were out of people's minds, doesn't mean the graves weren't revisited. Seeing the secondary rites, beginning to think of it as a much more long, drawn-out process, and thinking around the temporality of death a little bit more. That's definitely something that I'm super excited by. I think there's lots and lots of good things to look forward to in terms of the research that's coming next.
Gosh, that's wonderful, inspirational comment at the end of an exhausting term for me, and I'm sure yourself. Other interviews that you mentioned, Lindsay. Yes, that we had an interview with one of your colleagues at York. We've got one with Dr. Jessica Soretsa-Roman, who's done a lot of amazing work on cremation, thermally altered human remains in the US and all over the place, really. And Alison Cleveness, who works on early medieval stuff, but grave robbing, looking at people who go back to graves and move stuff around. So I think that is a common theme, Penny, that's coming through a lot of these interviews. Although you said it in a more enthusiastic way than I have energy for, which is wonderful. I think it is a really exciting time, and I think that's why I think this is an important moment post this. Pandemic's not over, but at the hopefully the tail end of this process, to start being able to use these digital formats to sort of take forward the conversations, not simply with conferences and more workshops, but by having this media just to have a conversation about these things. So I think in the next few years it'd be really interesting to see where all this goes. But I wish you so much good wishes with all your projects, and there's so much exciting things you're doing, both with the dead and without the dead, or a bit of both. And thank you so much for so eloquently sharing your thoughts today with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Howard.
If you've enjoyed this Archaeodeath video, why not check out the Archaeodeath blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.